The rain had been falling for hours, drumming steadily against the windows of Eliza Harcourt's small London flat. She was preparing a simple supper when the knock came. It was sharp and deliberate, the sort of knock that made the air still. When she opened the door, there was no one there, only a large cream envelope resting on the welcome mat, its edges damp from the rain. Her name was written in an elegant hand, Miss Eliza Harcourt. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, bearing an ornate family crest she had never seen before. The message was brief. You are requested to attend a reading of the late Lord Wetherby's will at Wetherby Grange, North Yorkshire. Your presence is required on the 12th of November, at 6 o'clock in the evening. It was signed simply, Giles Whitcomb, solicitor. Eliza's first thought was that it must be a mistake. She had never heard of Lord Wetherby, let alone met him. Her parents had died when she was young, and her family connections had always been a mystery. But there was something about the weight of the paper, the formal lettering, that told her this was no prank. The next morning, she boarded the train to Yorkshire. The countryside grew wilder as the journey went on, rolling hills giving way to dense woods and vast fields. When she stepped off at the small station, a tall man in a dark overcoat was waiting. You must be Miss Harcourt, he said. His voice was deep, clipped. I am Whitcomb. The carriage is this way. They drove in silence along winding lanes, the hedgerows glistening with rain. Wetherby Grange appeared suddenly out of the mist, an imposing stone mansion with turrets and tall chimneys, its windows glowing faintly in the grey afternoon. Inside, the entrance hall was vast, with a marble floor and a staircase that swept upwards into shadow. Several people were already gathered by the fire, a severe-looking woman in black silk, a man with a silver-tipped cane, and two young women who kept whispering to one another. Whitcomb cleared his throat. We shall begin shortly. Until then, Miss Harcourt, please make yourself comfortable. But as Eliza removed her coat, she noticed the severe-looking woman watching her closely, her eyes sharp, calculating, as if trying to measure something unseen. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, came the unmistakable sound of a door slamming, followed by footsteps that seemed to hurry away into the darkness. Eliza moved closer to the warmth of the great stone fireplace, though the heat did little to ease the chill that had settled in her bones since she had stepped inside Wetherby Grange. The severe-looking woman in black silk finally approached. You are Eliza Harcourt, she said, not a question but a statement. I am Mrs. Agatha Wetherby. My late husband was Lord Wetherby's younger brother. Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Before Eliza could reply, a younger man stepped forward. He had dark hair slicked neatly back and eyes that held an amused glint. Cousin, is it? I am Henry Wetherby, he said. Or perhaps I should say, distant cousin. We shall see after the will is read. There was a faint tension in his words, and Eliza caught the quick glance he exchanged with Mrs. Wetherby. Whitcomb the solicitor reappeared, ushering everyone towards a long table in the adjoining room. The table gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier, its surface set with silver candlesticks and stacks of documents. As they took their seats, Eliza noticed the two young women from earlier were now whispering more urgently, casting furtive glances at the empty chair at the far end of the table. Is someone missing? Eliza asked in a low voice to Henry, who sat beside her. He leaned in slightly. That would be Thomas Wetherby. Never on time. Never entirely sober. A faint smirk played on his lips. Before Eliza could respond, the chandelier above them flickered once, twice, and then went dark. The room was plunged into shadow, save for the wavering candlelight. A few murmurs of annoyance broke the silence. When the light sputtered back to life moments later, the empty chair at the far end was still empty. But the whispers had stopped, replaced by a peculiar stillness. It was Mrs. Wetherby who finally spoke. He was here earlier, she said, her voice tight. I saw him in the corridor not 10 minutes ago. Whitcomb frowned, his eyes narrowing. Then where? he asked slowly. Is Thomas now? The search for Thomas began almost at once. Henry was the first to rise, muttering that his cousin was probably passed out in some quiet corner of the house. Mrs. Wetherby, however, seemed far less convinced. Eliza followed the others through a dim corridor lined with stern portraits of past Wetherbys. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her every step. The air grew colder the further they went, the scent of damp stone mixing with a faint trace of something metallic. They reached a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. It was locked. Henry rattled the handle with growing irritation. He could be in there, he said. Whitcomb produced a small ring of keys from his pocket. As he searched for the right one, Eliza noticed a thin line of light seeping from beneath the door, as though a single candle burned within. The lock clicked, and the door swung inward with a long, complaining creak. The room beyond was small, its walls lined with shelves of old leather-bound books. A candle burned on the desk, its flame trembling in the draught. Beside it lay a half-finished glass of brandy. But there was no sign of Thomas Wetherby. Something made Eliza step further in. That was when she saw the chair. It had been knocked over, and on the carpet beside it was a single cufflink, gold, engraved with a letter T. Mrs. Wetherby bent to pick it up, her fingers trembling slightly. "This is his," she whispered. Before anyone could speak, the candlelight flickered again, and from the open window came the sound of footsteps on the wet gravel below. Fast footsteps, retreating into the night. Henry was the first to reach the window, leaning out into the damp night air. "I can't see a thing," he muttered, his breath clouding in the cold. The mist was thick, curling over the gravel drive like a living thing. Whitcomb ordered the others to remain inside while he and Henry went out to investigate. Eliza hesitated, then followed them despite Mrs. Wetherby's disapproving glare. The front doors groaned as they opened, and the three stepped into the swirling fog. The sound of footsteps had faded, replaced by the distant hoot of an owl and the restless sighing of the wind through the trees. Somewhere nearby, a gate creaked. They rounded the side of the house, their boots crunching on the wet stones. A faint shadow moved ahead of them, tall, broad-shouldered, the outline of a man striding away. "Thomas!" Henry called. The figure didn't turn. They quickened their pace, but the fog seemed to thicken with every step. The figure slipped into the dark gap between two outbuildings, vanishing from sight. When they reached the spot, there was nothing there. Only the smell of damp earth and the faint glimmer of something lying in the mud. Eliza bent down and picked it up. It was a scrap of cloth, torn and frayed, soaked through. Even in the poor light, she could see it was deep crimson, like the lining of a gentleman's coat. Before she could speak, a sudden sound cut through the silence, the distant slam of a door from inside the house. But they were all outside. They hurried back inside, boots leaving wet prints across the marble floor. The sound had come from the east wing, a part of the house Whitcomb explained had been closed for years. "This section has not been entered since Lord Wetherby's illness," he said, his voice low. "It is best left undisturbed." Henry raised an eyebrow. "And yet, someone is clearly disturbing it tonight." The corridor leading to the east wing was dim, the wall lamps unlit. Dust coated the skirting boards, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the high ceiling. At the far end, a single door stood ajar. Whitcomb pushed it open with care. The room beyond was spacious but barren, no furniture except a covered armchair by the fireplace. The air was stale, carrying the faint scent of mold. Eliza stepped inside, drawn to the fireplace. That was when she noticed the footprints in the dust. They led from the door to the window and back again, stopping abruptly in the center of the room. "Someone has been here very recently," she said. Henry crossed to the window and found it locked from the inside. "Then how did they leave?" he murmured. Before anyone could answer, a faint metallic sound came from beneath the armchair. Eliza knelt and reached under, her fingers brushing something cold. She pulled it into the light, a small brass key, old and tarnished, with an ornate W engraved on its bow. Whitcomb took it, his expression unreadable. This belongs to a room upstairs. A room that has been locked for decades. As he spoke, a sudden thud echoed above their heads, directly from the floor above, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged. The staircase to the upper floor groaned under their weight as they climbed. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed deeper here, stretching long along the narrow corridor. Whitcomb stopped before a heavy door at the far end. The brass plate above the handle bore the same ornate W as the key. Without a word, he handed the key to Eliza. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned it in the lock. The mechanism clicked, and the door swung open with surprising ease. The room inside was shrouded in dust sheets, each covering the shape of forgotten furniture. A faint draft whispered through the space, carrying the scent of old wood and something faintly metallic. Eliza crossed to the center of the room, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. In the far corner stood a tall wardrobe. Its doors were ajar, revealing darkness within. Henry moved ahead of her and pulled the doors fully open. Inside hung a few moth-eaten coats, and at the bottom, a pair of boots. They were muddy, fresh mud clinging to the soles. "That is not dust from decades past," Henry murmured. Whitcomb was already scanning the floor. "The footprints," he said. "They lead there." They all followed the trail to the far wall, where the wallpaper bulged slightly. Henry ran his hands over it, and with a soft click, a narrow panel swung inward, revealing a dark passageway descending into the house's hidden depths. From somewhere below came the faint but unmistakable sound of a man's voice, muffled, strained, as if calling for help. The narrow passage was lined with cold stone, the walls damp beneath Eliza's fingertips as they descended. Their footsteps echoed, mingling with the soft drip of unseen water. The air grew heavier, carrying the scent of earth and decay. Henry held a candle high, its flicker casting unsteady shadows along the twisting walls. The muffled voice grew clearer, hoarse, urgent, though still impossible to make out. The passage opened suddenly into a low chamber. Cobwebs hung like curtains, and the floor was littered with crates, old trunks, and discarded furniture. In the far corner, bound to a chair, sat Thomas Wetherby. His head was bowed, his coat torn, and the crimson lining confirmed the scrap Eliza had found earlier. Whitcomb hurried forward, loosening the ropes. "Who did this to you?" he demanded. Thomas looked up, his face pale and damp with sweat. I don't know," he rasped. "Someone came from behind. I never saw their face." Henry glanced around the room. They could still be down here. A sudden sound interrupted him, a faint scrape from the darkness beyond the crates. It was followed by the shuffle of footsteps retreating deeper into the shadows. Henry raised the candle, illuminating a narrow gap between two walls. The passage beyond looked even older, the stones worn and blackened with age. Without waiting for agreement, he stepped forward. But before he could take another step, a gust of air extinguished the candle, plunging them into complete darkness. Eliza's heart pounded as she stood before the hidden door at the end of the cellar corridor. The oak was blackened with age, the iron handle cold beneath her trembling fingers. Behind her, the muffled voices of the remaining guests echoed faintly, but none dared follow her down this far. She knew she had to face whatever truth Wetherby Grange had been guarding for decades. She turned the handle slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick and stale, scented faintly with wax and something metallic. Candles, half-burnt and abandoned, lined a long table in the center of the room. Upon it lay stacks of parchment, sealed envelopes, and a single oil lamp casting shadows that danced against the walls. At the far end of the table stood a tall cabinet. Its doors were ajar, revealing shelves stuffed with old ledgers and faded photographs. Eliza's breath caught when she saw the faces in those pictures, each one an ancestor she had seen in the portraits upstairs. But there were others, too. People she did not recognize. People whose eyes seemed to follow her. A sudden creak came from behind her. She spun around to see a figure stepping into the candlelight. It was Lady Blackwell, her gown dark as morning silk, her expression unreadable. "You should not have come here, Eliza," she said quietly, almost tenderly. "You have seen what must remain buried." Before Eliza could reply, Lady Blackwell reached into the folds of her gown and withdrew a small brass key. She held it up, letting the lamplight catch on its teeth. "This opens the one door in Wetherby Grange that even your uncle never dared to enter," she whispered. "And once you cross that threshold, you will never see this house, or your life, in the same way again." Lady Blackwell placed the key into Eliza's palm, her fingers lingering for a moment. Then she stepped back into the shadows, leaving Eliza alone with the silent table and the door beyond. The key felt heavier than any she had ever held. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Slowly, she turned to face the final door, its frame hidden behind a tapestry of a hunting scene. She drew the fabric aside, revealing the lock that awaited her. And then, with a deep breath, she slid the key in. The door clicked open.